afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Chloe Cole, and I am a detransitioner and a former trans-identified kid. I don't really feel like either of those descriptors, though, really just captures the permanence and seriousness of what I've been through. From a very young age, I had quite a bit of a tomboyish streak. I really felt like I related a lot more to my male peers, my older brothers, my dad, my boy cousins, and I really looked up to my big brothers. I wanted to be strong and cool and funny just like them. And sure, I was also pretty girly as well, but the older I got, the more of a tomboy I became naturally. And I mean, I would often hear things like, well, why aren't you more girly? You need to be more ladylike. And this made me feel like this part of myself took away from my value as a girl. And the messages that I was receiving growing up around being female seemed to present it as a very superficial experience where much of your worth would come from your looks or your body or your sexuality. And I grew up in the age of women being expected to be curvy, thick, bottom heavy, pear or hourglass shaped. And I mean, as a girl who was already pretty early into puberty, I started puberty, my breasts started developing before I even hit the age of 9, before I was even in 4th grade. And that was already a pretty uncomfortable experience. I felt like I was being thrust into adulthood faster than my own mind was. And with all these expectations of how I was supposed to behave or act, it was very difficult for me to keep up with. I felt like as a girl who liked to dress in boy clothes or have her hair short or had a little bit more muscle in her body and wasn't really quite as developed, I didn't really know where my worth as an adult woman would really come from. And I thought that there was something wrong with me because I found it difficult to connect with my older sisters and the girls around me. And there were times when I really started to believe that maybe I would have been happier if I were born as a boy. I mean, it just, in my head, it didn't make sense for me to be a girl when I felt like, both in terms of the way that I looked and thought and acted, that I was just too boyish. I never really believed, though, that I actually was a boy until I learned about transgenderism through social media. And I got my first phone right before my 12th birthday, before 7th grade. And naturally, I mean, everybody else my age already had a cell phone. They already had smartphones, and they were already all using social media apps like Instagram and Snapchat and Kik. And I wanted to see what I was missing out on. So that was one of the first places I went to. I made my first Instagram account, and I mean, I was hooked already. Because Instagram, it's a very, very simple, very image-based platform, and naturally that's something that appeals to a younger generation. And a lot of the content that I was seeing on there was related to my own personal interests, things like anime, manga, comics, books, illustration, video games, you name it. I soon noticed, though, that a lot of the members within these communities were people around my age, maybe about like 12 to their early 20s, and a lot of them identified as a member of the LGBT. Some of them called themselves gay or lesbian, some were bisexual, some used other labels like pansexual or asexual, but a lot of them were young men and young women and girls my age who identified as the opposite sex. And all of this was very novel to me at the time. I had never really grown up being exposed to stuff like this. And it was incredibly interesting to me. All these new terms and phrases that you could use to describe yourself, and all these colorful flags, and the overall message of acceptance of those who are different, who come from different backgrounds, who have their own flaws and of self-discovery. It really hit close to home to me, especially as somebody who didn't really feel like she fit in growing up. I mean, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, right? And there's quite a bit of a gap between me and my older siblings. They're about like 7 to 8 years older than me. And by the time that I was in middle school, most of them had pretty much already moved out. So I was kind of growing up as almost like an only child for the second half of my childhood. And at school, I had been bullied for my differences in socialization, in my interests, and because I was emotionally unstable and prone to outbursts. The other kids found it funny to provoke me, to get me upset. And I would always get in trouble for it. And the way that I was handled by adults was always incredibly poor. And this, alongside with my body image issues, was just horrible for my self-esteem growing up. But this idea that even if I was born as a girl, even if it was incredibly painful for me to deal with, it didn't have to be that way. I didn't have to grow up into a woman. I could be a boy. I could be a man. And at first, I just experimented with different labels around my sexuality and then my gender. And then I started to think, well, I don't think it makes sense for me to be a girl. There's just no way that I'm anything other than a boy. And so I took on a new name. Over time, I gradually started to cut my hair shorter and secretly swap out the clothing in my wardrobe for boys' clothing. And I decided to one day come out to my mom and dad through a letter. And the reason why I chose a letter was because even though I knew that they loved me, I wasn't exactly sure about how they would respond, how they would receive it. And I was kind of intimidated by the idea of bringing that up to them face to face. And I knew even then that it could be intimidating for them as well. And so the letter gave us a period of time where we could think to ourselves about how we would talk about this. And when they were ready, they were pretty accepting, at least superficially. They didn't want to force me into doing anything. They wanted to let me just express myself and dress differently and just discover myself. But they were also very sensible. They didn't want me to undergo any permanent interventions because they understood that I was a child and that I couldn't be making any permanent decisions for myself, especially around my body and around my developments. They wanted to just let me grow up within boundaries. And they also were kind of concerned as to where this was coming from because they never really heard anything like this from any of my older siblings. And it seemed kind of sudden to them. My dad especially kind of suspected that it might have to do with some of my mental health issues growing up, with having been bullied, struggling to fit in, possibly my previous diagnosis with ADHD. And so they started doing their research, and they found online that our healthcare provider at the time, Kaiser Permanente, was recommended as a top choice in our home state of California in caring for youth who identify as transgender or experience gender dysphoria. And they thought that care meant that I would undergo a proper psychological evaluation to really dive into the causes behind these feelings, why I wanted to reject my sex as a girl so badly, and maybe see whether it's related to my mental health issues. And really just to allow me to be a kid in the meanwhile. And they were completely blindsided by what happened next when they decided to hire a therapist for me. So they were not allowed to be inside the room at all while I was going through the consultations. They had no idea what was actually being discussed in these appointments. They presented the option to me of not having them there. And I hadn't really thought about it before, but when that was given to me, it was like, well, maybe there is something that I don't want them to hear. Maybe I would get in trouble. And these doctors never really even followed up with my parents afterward. What was actually going on in these appointments or with my mental health? And I found that I was actually getting worse because the therapist that I was seeing at the time, though he was affirming me in my preferred identity and name and the pronouns I wanted him to use, he wasn't actually addressing the other issues that I had in my life, at home, in school, with the bullying. And it felt kind of hopeless for me. It felt like nothing was happening. And so I started to feel more distress naturally around my body and around my gender and my transition. And I started telling my parents, I want to go on the physical interventions next. I want to be a real boy. I want to be on testosterone. And of course, they, as the responsible parents that they were very concerned about this. They didn't want me to be making these decisions at such a young age. And so they turned to the doctor with their concerns. They asked why it had to be so soon, why this had to be so rushed, why now? Why can't we wait until I'm an adult? What could happen if she regrets these treatments? And their concerns were just brushed aside immediately. They were told that there was no other choice, that children already know what their identity is, because gender identity is innate and it's understandable from a young age. They also tried to convince them that it was life or death for their own kid, that they could either have a suicidal and potentially dead daughter or a living, happy, thriving transgender son. And when you're a parent faced with the possibility of the death of your own child by a doctor, what wouldn't you do to keep them alive and well? So they took the only choice that our family was given, and they signed off on the treatments. And I don't really even consider it consent. It was under duress. It was coercion. They were emotionally manipulated by our doctors, these so-called medical professionals who they trusted to help care for me, to help them in raising me through this. And just within about less than half a year of first seeing a therapist was when I was administered my first shot of puberty blockers at the age of 13, just halfway through my sophomore year. And because I was already roughly about 3 to 4 years into my puberty at that time, the lack of sex hormones in my body essentially sent me into a chemically induced phase of menopause. So after about 2 weeks after the shot, I had a very heavy period, and then came menopausal side effects, such as hot flashes, which, I mean, it really was like a really uncomfortable feeling of my body just being hot, like to the point that like during some days during the winter I couldn't even wear like warm clothing. I would have to attend school in a t-shirt and shorts because it was that awful. And this feeling was accompanied by tingling sensations, itching, and sometimes like even like burning sensations in my hands and my limbs. And it was incredibly uncomfortable. And of course, I was also very lethargic because of the absence of sex hormones in my body. So it was like every day I was waking up just counting the days down until I would be on the very next intervention, which of course was the testosterone. And compared to not having any sex hormones in my body at all, while I was supposed to be going through puberty. Being on testosterone felt great. It felt amazing. I finally had my energy back. I felt you could say that it was almost sort of a stimulant. I started to feel very confident, and I also experienced a very sharp um, increase in my sex drive that came pretty much immediately. And this, over the years, this proved to be very dangerous for me because, I mean, whereas like an actual biological male going through male puberty experiences an increase in his sex drive gradually over time, this was a sudden spike for me. And I basically became hypersexual. I had a lot of illicit online relationships with adult men, and I became very prone to being groomed sexually by adults. I've been taken advantage of sexually several times during my teenhood. And the physical side effects the physical effects rolled around about really only within about 2 to 3 weeks afterward, starting with the drop in my voice, which was very immediate. It was kind of uncomfortable, actually. Not physically, but because I had such a deep voice. It was deeper than most of the boys my age, and even a lot of my male teachers when I was going to high school. And then came the changes to my appearance, such as the hair all over my body, including on top of my head, my eyebrows, my eyelashes, my facial hair, on my limbs. It all thickened. And my body shape was starting to become more, my shoulders became more heavy. I became more muscular. And as I worked out, it became very easy to build muscle, which was a huge boost in my confidence. It felt like, for once, I finally felt like I looked good. I looked healthy. I had control over myself. And of course, you could say that I experienced the gender euphoria that the transgender community often speaks of. That feeling of, wow, this is a huge step in my life towards becoming my greater self as the boy I always was supposed to be. And for a while, I felt satisfied. I was excited, maybe happy even. But I was still in my 8th grade year, and for most of my classmates had known me since elementary school. They knew that I actually was a girl. And I knew this very well. And I decided that I wouldn't really make any further effort to blend in as a boy until I entered high school. That is, until one day, one of my classmates who had been bullying me throughout the school year had gone too far, and he had sexually assaulted me in a crowded classroom. In a crowded classroom. And this situation never really was resolved for several reasons. I mean, I was already in a very unhealthy mindset, really believing myself to be a boy. And if I showed any signs of weakness, that would be humiliating for me. I mean, how could I tell anybody about this? Especially because I couldn't even trust the staff at the school that I went to. I had an IEP 504 plan in place to help with my education because I had certain needs in my classes that just weren't being met. That my teachers and the staff in the office were just ignoring. If they weren't helping me to learn, how could I expect them to help me after my safety was compromised by another one of their students on their school campus? It felt like there was no winning. And I knew that if I even tried to put up a fight with a school that I didn't even feel comfortable at, I mean, the boy would have known exactly who it was who reported him. I could have been in danger because of the incompetence of my teachers. So I didn't bother. And by the time I went to high school, I had mostly forgotten about this incident, but not in my heart. not in my soul. It was something that fear of somebody even recognizing the fact that I was female, that stayed in the back of my mind for years to come. And it influenced a lot of my decisions, including to further blend in and to start hiding my breasts by use of a compression device called a breast binder, and also to take certain classes so that I wouldn't be changing in the gym locker room where something like that could happen again if somebody knew that I was actually a girl. But when I went to high school, I already had my name changed in the school files, and I had a fairly deep voice, and I looked pretty much like any other 14, 15, 16-year-old boy. And I started to develop friendships with, I guess you could say, like a more male dynamic and role. And I'll admit, I made quite a few good memories that I still really value to this day because of those days. And I think I learned quite a few valuable lessons, especially about the hardships that young men tend to go through. And I feel like I have become a lot more understanding of their experience. But it wasn't for me. It was very difficult for me to fit into that role as a girl. And I didn't really have any guidance on how to really go about it. It was a big responsibility for me, especially because now I was expected to be tough. I was expected to just man up and not really talk about the personal hardships that I was experiencing, that eventually became part of my day-to-day. The testosterone itself made it very difficult for me to process any negative emotions that I was experiencing. I found it very difficult to cry, to even get to the point of crying. And no matter how long I did it, most of the time I would get absolutely no release from it. And my relationships with my family, with my friends, they were no longer as intimate as they were. I felt like I didn't really have anybody to confide in. And oftentimes my negative feelings would just bubble up, and I would express it in very unhealthy ways. And I even started to dabble a little bit into substance abuse. And by the time that I was in my sophomore year of high school, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and I was medicated for it. After a period of time of almost being euphoric and feeling very confident in this newfound identity and lifestyle, I went back to my baseline, and then I became worse, and I went down a spiral. And nothing was working, no matter what medications they were treating me with, no matter what dosage it was, no matter what they were telling me in therapy. It was like nobody was even questioning that this treatment might have been the cause of that. In fact, they often talked about my daily struggles as if it was all about my gender, right? The very first question that I would always be asked in my appointments with my therapist was, "So how's your gender dysphoria doing?" And it was like, "Well, I've been on testosterone for a few years, and I pass as the opposite sex. Everybody knows me as a boy, and I think I'm happy with that because that's what I was told was supposed to happen." But nothing was going right. And the stress of being taken advantage of by older men, and of my grades dropping and not being able to focus in my classes or really on anything in my day-to-day life was starting to take its toll on me. And I also started to get sick of using the chest binders because I live right in the middle of California where, during the hot season, it gets up to like 100 degrees on a good day. And I would wear this thing whenever I'd be walking home from school, whenever I would go out for a workout or swimming, or whenever I was really out where I was going to be seen by somebody, because I didn't want anybody to know that I actually had breasts. It would be a very awkward thing for them to see. But I felt like I wanted to be free of it. I wanted to stop wearing it every day. And I wanted to just look like any other boy my age, because the more changes that were being brought upon my body by the hormones, the more dissociated I felt. Because most of my body was, for the most part, pretty boyish looking. But I still had my chest. And I didn't realize still then that I had this sexual trauma in the back of my mind. And all of that influenced my decision to start seeking surgery about halfway through my sophomore year. And during the summer after, when I was only 15 years old, I underwent a double mastectomy, and my breasts were removed. And at first, I thought when I woke up that this was yet another big step in my life towards becoming my true self as a man. And that I was looking forward to going through the full course of healing and finally being able to work out, to swim without having to wear a shirt or a binder. That one day I could just bare my chest to the sun and be free. But that never happened. I started to realize soon after that trying to be a boy was too much for me, both with the social responsibility of it and even the little things about being a girl that I missed, like having long hair, being able to style it in a feminine way, being able to wear skirts and dresses. I started to miss it. I missed having a more feminine form and face. Now, I didn't like that my body was becoming more and more boyish looking. But it was very difficult for me to admit to myself for the longest time. Even the idea that this could have been a mistake for me. Because I was so deep into it. I had a very deep voice. It's actually lightened up quite a bit since then. But as I said, it was deeper than even a lot of the adult males around me. And everybody in my life knew me as a boy named Leo. I was their transgender son, nephew, grandson, brother. With everybody in my life being involved in my transition, how could I look them all in the face and admit that this was all wrong? I justified it in my head as, well, sometimes some men are effeminate, and that's okay. Or perhaps maybe I'm still trans, but I'm something else. Maybe I'm non-binary. But nothing worked. I started to wear some of my old girl clothes and sometimes even buy skirts or makeup from the drugstore. And I would just wear it in the comfort of my room. And it was painful that I couldn't be seen by anybody like that. Into the later half of my junior year, I was taking a class in psychology. And the end of the course was focused primarily on children and childhood and adolescent psychological developments and how the way that a child is raised plays into all of that and their later identity formation as an adult. And it was just a huge wake-up call for me. It was a slap in the face learning about this thing that I never had really considered before. I mean, in my consultations for hormones and for the surgery, I was told that it might affect my ability to conceive or that my ability to breastfeed would be taken away after losing my breasts. But this meant nothing to me at the time because I thought, well, men don't give birth, men don't breastfeed. And besides, how could I have considered having children of my own while I was still growing up? There is no way. I didn't have the appropriate maturity or experience in the world yet to make a decision around those things. But now that I was 16, less than a year after losing my breasts, I was learning about these things in depth. I realized that I had a maternal instinct. I wanted to become a mother, and I wanted to do that naturally. I wanted to get married, I wanted to be a wife, and I wanted to get pregnant, give birth, and to feed my children the way God intended. But my breasts, this huge part of my identity, my sexuality, and of myself as an aspiring mother, was now gone, and I would never get it back. And this epiphany broke my heart. I didn't know what to do with myself for the longest time. But I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't even look at the vial of testosterone or take the shots anymore. I was done. And for a period of time, I couldn't even bring myself to call myself a girl. I just knew that this never should have happened. And in making the decision to stop transitioning, I lost a lot. I lost everything that I knew. This identity that I once was so comfortable with. My relationship with the transgender community, even my friendships at school, and the support from all my doctors who had supported me through my initial transition. All that was gone. Now I had to face my mom and dad and tell them that it was all wrong. And I knew that they would feel incredible guilt. And they did. And when I announced to my friends and on my personal social media that I was detransitioning, that it was painful for me, that I was full of regret and both physical and emotional pain, I was met with hatred by this community that once embraced me as if they were a second family. That was all gone for me. Now they were turning their backs on me, telling me that this was all my fault, that I should have known better. Maybe I was young, but I wasn't a baby. I was capable of making my own decisions. And frankly, that I should shut up, because in talking about my experience, I was just making other people uncomfortable. I wasn't helping anybody. I was harming the transgender community by potentially preventing them, these real transgender people, from getting the care that they might need, their life-saving care. It didn't matter that it ruined my life or that it destroyed parts of my body, because most transgender people, they don't experience that. My experience wasn't significant. And for a while, I gave in to their demands. I didn't know what to do because, I was only a 16-year-old girl. I had never had people in my life saying such awful things to me, especially about something that was so painful and intimate. But I soon discovered that all of this was a lie. I was lied to by my doctors, by this community, and that there was a whole community of thousands of people just like me who had been through the ringer with transitioning, either socially or medically, and had the exact same outcome as me. And some of them had it worse than I did. Some of them couldn't go back because they had already been through the surgery or because they'd already been sterilized by the treatments. And their health was suffering. It felt comforting to know that I wasn't the only one who was struggling with this, that there were other detransitioners out there. At the same time, though, this instilled deep fear in me. It was painful knowing that I wasn't, in fact, the only one. And most of these people who I was speaking to at the time were adults, and most of them had transitioned while they were adults. But seeing as I had been let through the system as a child, and I'd actually been at a top surgery class before getting my surgery, where there was about 15 or so other kids attending, I knew that there has to have been many other children who transitioned while they were still kids. That many of them, even just one of them, had to have an outcome like me. And if I was getting such an awful response from my doctors and from other transgender people just for talking about the fact that I stopped, how are those kids dealing with it? How are they reacting to them? I mean, for a little bit, I couldn't take it. I couldn't keep talking about it. But I knew then that I had to start. I felt like I had this responsibility to, because even though I didn't know any personally, I just knew intuitively that there had to be many other children and families who had been through exactly what I have. And I decided that it was no better time than then to start speaking out about my experience. And since then, well, I started small. I just talked about it with friends, with family, on my personal social media, and then I decided that I would go public with my story. That I would make a Twitter account where I talk about my experience. And I honestly was not expecting to go very far. I really wasn't expecting to have a very big platform, and that my voice would reach maybe a few thousand people at most. But very soon, there were dozens of parents reaching out to me because their kids, they were struggling with the very same thing with their own children. And then there were reporters reaching out to me, which helped my voice to reach. And eventually one day, there was a nonprofit, a parent group that reached out to me asking if I would be willing to testify on a bill to help protect children. And since then, I've spoken on quite a few of those bills, and many other detransitioners, many other former trans children have also joined the fight to protect our fellow kids and to prevent what happened to us from ever happening ever again. And it's important for me to mention that the role that faith has played in all this. When I was a kid, I went to church up until I was maybe about 4 or 5 years old. So I wasn't too old. My mom was raised Catholic and my dad Mormon. But after a while, they didn't want to, I feel like they didn't really want to feel like they were forcing any sort of belief system on me, and they wanted me to develop that on my own as I grew up. And while I understand that, I feel like it made it so that I didn't really have as much structure in terms of my beliefs and my values growing up. And it also made it so that I didn't really have as much of a community either, now that I was no longer going to church. And I feel like this was a pretty integral part of my struggle with my identity growing up, that lack of faith. And it wasn't until after I detransitioned that I started surrounding myself with more diverse groups of people in the real sense, in the real meaning of the word, diverse in terms of thought and beliefs. That I was surrounded by a lot of Christians within my family, my friend groups, family friends, and even while I was speaking out, I was invited to churches and to work with Christian groups. And since I was in about my sophomore year of high school, I felt like with how imperfect humans are, there's just no way that we are the greatest beings, the highest form of consciousness out there. With all of these scientific discoveries that we're making, it's just, it seems almost like everything around us was just, it was designed intelligently. And I came to discover that it was, and that I was made the way that I was for a reason. And one piece of scripture that's really been inspiring to me, that's been keeping me going through this, is the excerpt, Matthew 5, verses 3 to 12. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In speaking the truth, we will be persecuted. It's a tale as old as time. I'm only 19 years old now. I've been speaking publicly since I was only 17. I had a lot to lose in doing so, including my friends from school, from within the transgender community, my precious time with my family. I've dedicated the past year of my life to this cause, and I'm missing out on a lot. Things like college and an important period of socialization right now, not to mention that since I made the decision to stand my ground, I've burned many bridges that I don't know if they will ever be rebuilt. And I'm sure that as parents, as grandparents, aunts and uncles, employees, members of the church, you all too have a lot that could be at stake. But frankly, I believe that we as adults, we all have a responsibility to uphold our communities, no matter the cost, because no cost is greater than the lives and well-being of our youth. There is an insidious ideology that seeks to infect the minds and bodies of our children, and it's already infected our educational and healthcare institutions. It's been creeping from under our noses for far too long. There is no time more important than now to fight back, to protect our country, our values, and most importantly, our families. Let's make sure that what happened to me and thousands of other children and vulnerable young adults will never happen again. Thank you all.